Thank you. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Karen Brown, and I'm a tax professor here, but also very associated with our International Comparative Law Program. And so Dean Joshi, Dean Solorio, who are here, are people that I really admire and respect a lot, and I want to associate with them all the time. And they helped organize this event with Alexandre Rodde, who is a 2015 graduate of the law school in the LLM program. He is here just out of the goodness of his heart. Right? He offered to come, and we were excited to have him come. He's a researcher on terrorism and mass casualty events. He's given lectures really all over the country. I know you've even come to the U.S. and given lectures on some issues. Obviously, these issues of terrorism affect a lot of countries. He's also a first lieutenant in the French National Gendarmerie Reserves, and he's a very distinguished and accomplished graduate of GW, of whom we're very proud. He's going to speak about his book, Terrorism in France, and if any of you had a chance to take a look at it, it is amazing. It is quite a compendium. As you all know, really since 9/11 here in this country, there's been a renewed focus on terrorism, and the UN at that time set up, serious anti-terrorism efforts. And I was surprised to learn that in the European Union, France is a country that has had the most, been the object of the largest number of attacks or attempted terrorism attacks. So this obviously is timely and important for France as well as the rest of us. And I was looking at the book. I haven't finished reading it. It's quite long, almost 400 pages. And it is basically a systematic study of the period from 2012 to 2022, and makes an original, very original and invaluable contribution to the study of jihadism. His research and analysis focuses on the ground, on the intelligence forces, security forces that are addressing these menaces every day, as well as a study of the people who are perpetrating the terrorism, their modes of operation, their beliefs, their methods, and looking at sort of their ideology, their politics, their social motivation, and cultural motivations for what they do. And so without further ado, I want to thank Alexandre for coming and welcome you.
Thank you so much. Here what we're going to try to do, probably do about 25 minutes of presentation and slide, and I'll take question at any time if anything is unclear. I'm also aware that I speak fast and with an accent, so feel free once again to clarify if anything is too fast. Does it work? Oh, works again. As I said, so we do a short presentation about the situation in France, going back from 2012 to nowadays, talk about the future of the threat and what's worrying us at the moment. We are now 4 months out of the Olympics. Will take place in Paris and all over France this summer. Once again, as I said, I'm aware that I speak fast and with an accent, so feel free to ask me to clarify if anything is unclear. In a quick summary of the thing we're going to cover, starting with the revival of the threat in the 2012-2014 era, then the period of mass jihad from 2015 to 2016, the period where we saw a number of attacks from Charlie Hebdo to the Paris attacks. I think it's dying.
Maybe this one, what do you think?
Is it better? Does it work? Ah, yeah, perfect. So going to that period of 2015 to 2016, where we faced a number of attacks were quite unique in their scale and in their organizations, to the reduction of the threat 2017 and 2019, and then we'll focus more closely on the period from 2020 to 2024, but we are still in, with the transformation of the threat in France and a number of regular attacks changing in targets, in profile, and in modus operandi. So something you have to be considered that France faced jihadism and terrorism in general earlier than most of the West. When 9/11 was a turning point to the national security apparatus in the US, when the Madrid attack in 2004 killed 190 people, were the change for the Spanish situation, or 7/7 bombers for London. France faced jihadism attacks starting in the early 90s. 3 main attacks can be discussed at that point. In 1994, a French airliner was hijacked in Algeria. While on the ground, 4 terrorists were inside, killing 3 people and asking to be flown to Paris to do what they call a press conference. The situation went on for a few days before they decided to take off. Having not the normal amount of kerosene, they couldn't fly to Paris, so they had to fly to Marseille when they asked for more kerosene and no longer fly to Paris. The plan was at the time to fly that plane straight into Paris and try to crash it above the capital, probably striking the Eiffel Tower. We know that from local intelligence and from the demand they made of way more kerosene than necessary to fly from Marseille to Paris. The French GIGN was able to get in the plane, neutralize the 4 terrorists, and released all of the hostages just after Christmas 1994. 1995 to 1996, France faced a series of bombing in Paris and in the Lyon region by a group linked to the GIA, the Groupe Islamique Armé, who was putting bombs in the Parisian metro and all around various sites in London before being slowly neutralized over a period of 2 years. Then in 1996, for a period of about 6 months, we faced what they call the Roubaix Gang. Roubaix Gang was a group of French converts who went to fight in Yugoslavia for a year and a half. In Yugoslavia, they acquired skills and connections to armed traffickers and to jihadist groups, and decided to come back to France to commit a series of robberies using the skills they obtained in Yugoslavia and planning a terrorist attack all over France. The idea was to commit those robberies to try to finance global jihad in the UK, in Canada, and in Yugoslavia. Once again, after about 6 months, they were able to be found and neutralized. But France had seen that period of about 3 years where they faced a reasonable amount of jihadist attack on the regular and were quite acute to and aware of the threat at the time it took place. Obviously, things went on, 9/11 happened, and the rest of the world realized potential threat from international jihadism on their soil. During that period of about 16 years, from 1996 to 2012, France was spared any attacks. We had a number of arrests, we had a number of plans being organized, but we didn't see any attacks while New York, Washington, Madrid, London were facing a growing number of attacks and growing number of arrests. For about 16 years, we've been spared and we kind of lost touch with the threat, focusing on other areas of national security. In 2012, things changed. A terrorist called Mohamed Merah, who was 23 years old at the time, led a series of 3 attacks in Toulouse and Montauban in the southwest of France, killing 3 military personnel and 4 Jewish persons in front of a Jewish school, including 3 children, they are 5, 6, and 7. That series of attacks in Toulouse and Montauban was a big turning point of the French national security apparatus, changed a lot of things and showed us that the threat was evolving at a different pace we expected and was finding a new kind of form on French soil. Following those series of 3 attacks were quite a shock for the French nation in general. They happened during the presidential election. We also saw a succession of attacks every year. France has been facing at least 1 jihadist attack every year since 2012, and 1 deadly jihadist attack at least every year since 2015. In 2012, we can talk about the grenade attack against the Jewish supermarket in Sarcelles, the knife attack against military forces in La Défense, or the stabbing of a police officer in Joué in 2014. During the period of 2 years, we saw a number of things were quite new and were signs that the worst was yet to come. The first big change we saw at that time, we saw a transition from international jihad to local jihad. Most of the attacks we faced in the early 2000s were by individuals who went to train in Afghanistan, Pakistan, sometime Iraq, and came back on the soil they wanted to strike. Obviously, it's harder to do in 2011 if you, like some jihadists try to do, go to Pakistan for 6 months and said, I was there for a wedding. When you come back, intelligence services will arrest you and charge you. Mohamed Merah and the attack in Toulouse in France changed something. We faced a jihadist who wanted to go and train with a foreign group but couldn't do that, and decided to organize attacks on his own soil in an environment he knew, using his connection to drug traffickers to be able to finance and organize 3 complex attacks at a fast pace. That was the first sign of the autonomization of the French jihadist movement. We now had people who didn't expect a sign from a foreign group, who didn't expect connection or instruction, and were able to organize by themselves in smaller cells all over the city of France. At the same time, we had about 400 departures to Iraq and Syria. People wanted to fight either the Bashar al-Assad regime or join the Islamic State, sometimes both, and were growing the ranks of French jihadists, acquiring some sort of operational capacity and real taste for jihadist violence against France. during that same summer, or the summer of 2014, as I was arriving in DC, we were seeing a lot of calls to strike against French targets, both abroad and in France. That's what led us to the period of 2015-2016, period of mass jihad, which is an interesting example of something we haven't seen in the Western world before. From January 2015 and the Charlie Hebdo attacks, who killed 12 people in Paris, to September 2016, we saw a long ISIS campaign against France, was bigger and more lethal than everything we saw before. During that period of about 21 months, we faced 20 attacks, which was unheard of in the Western world. The attack on a way bigger scale. We talk in a second the Paris attacks, of basically 3 types of attacks. Some projected. The Islamic State was able to send operators from Iraq and Syria to Paris or Belgium and organize complex attacks with weaponries, with instructions, and with specific targets. Remote control attacks, mostly in 2016, when jihadist groups were able to contact people on social networks, give them instruction about targets, about accomplices, sometimes find them weapon to them and organize an attack, and inspire the attack by just sharing propaganda online and hoping that someone would follow the instructions. We'll stop for 1 second on the Paris attack with something quite special and which still is quite unique for national security apparatus to face. Is there any question before we start that? Fair. So, on November 13, 2015, Paris faced 3 attacks, were all different in nature and posed a significant number of challenges. The first attack took place in the Stade de France. Stade de France is the biggest stadium in France. That night, it was holding soccer games facing 78,000 people, and a number of VIP inside the stadium, the French president, the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and a number of other people. 3 terrorists wearing suicide vests killed themselves outside of the stadium. They were probably too late for the plan to be able to enter, and killing 1 person and injuring 53 others. That first attack was planned to try to lure as much police officers possible outside of Paris to try to have a more free reign for the following attacks, which took place 20 minutes later. Second attack took place on the patios of numerous restaurants in Paris. 3 of the terrorists shot at 4 restaurants and exploded a bomb in the 5th one, going fast from target to targets and killing a total of 39 people, while 1 of them died in the explosion of his suicide vest. That second attack was organized in order to try to confuse law enforcement, lots of targets at the same time, fast-paced and dynamic attacks, trying to make it more complicated for us to respond to the last attack who was planned and would take place at the Bataclan. The Bataclan was the site of the main attack. It was organized to be some sort of a special event. The jihadists chosen for that mission were all French citizens. They wanted to do French citizen killing French citizens as more of a symbolic gesture. 3 terrorists opened fire in a crowd of 1,500 people watching a concert by a Californian group called the Eagle of Death Metal. 90 people were killed, which made it the event the deadliest mass killing event of the West since World War II. And about 50 of them were taken hostages. After about 3 hours, the terrorists were neutralized by law enforcement in France, and the hostages were all released. That attack was a turning point for us. It was one of the biggest attacks we ever took place in the world, not comparable to 9/11, obviously, slightly under what we saw in Spain in 2004, but an attack against the French capital, against the French way of life, attacking stadiums, restaurants, concert hall, and the kind of attack we feared for the last few years. So I think the most similar attack we have seen before that was the Mumbai attack in 2008 with a group of 9 terrorists using explosive and light weapons to move throughout the city. After the period of about 21 months, we saw a number of things we never saw before. First, an operational tempo by jihadists which was unheard of. 20 attacks in 20 months is something we didn't face before. Then a change of modus operandi. We saw a number of things we never saw before in France. The use of suicide vests, the use of beheadings, which was, once again, a new subject for us. The government put in place a number of efforts on the military side, on the intelligence side, on the tactical side, who were able to have a significant impact on the threat in France and led to the reduction of it for the following years. The 2017 to 2019 period saw a big reduction of terrorist threat in France. We still had a number of attacks that were quite important compared to the rest of the Western world, but less numerous and also less lethal. During that period, we saw 17 attacks in 3 years, leading to 16 deaths. We still had a number of terrible event. I'm thinking, of course, about the Strasbourg Christmas market massacre, the Trèbes supermarket massacre, or the police headquarters in Paris, where a radicalized police officer killed 4 of his colleagues with a knife. But we still see a reduction of the threat. Attacks were less frequent, less deadly, and organized by people who were less organized than the previous period. The 2020 to 2024 era saw an interesting evolution of the threat, with a number of attacks variating, and the profile of terrorists is not the one we faced before. 2020 was an interesting year. We saw a rise in attacks, going from 3 the previous year to 7 that year, due to 2 phenomena. First, the COVID pandemic and the impact it had on the terrorist threat. It was really interesting to see how ISIS declarations impacted the terrorism threat in France regarding COVID. Starting in February 2020, when a number of ISIS statements saying that COVID was a divine punishment was sent to Europe against the treatment of Muslims there. Starting in March, they advised their fighters to not come to Europe, to not catch a virus, and went back on it saying the virus could only be caught by miscreant, and it was fine to go to Europe. We saw a number of things we didn't expect at that time. We had an attack in Romans-sur-Isère during the first lockdown in April 2020 by a jihadist who was really afraid of having caught COVID, didn't want to die of COVID, so chose to commit an attack to die as a martyr and not as a COVID patient, stabbing 7 people in France, killing 2 of them. At the same time, in September 2020, the trial for the January attacks, mostly in Charlie Hebdo, took place, and Charlie Hebdo decided to republish the cartoons that month. It led to a series of 3 attacks by people who were not really related to Charlie Hebdo, but in the end of jihadists were. So 2 terrorists being stabbed in front of the former offices of Charlie Hebdo, journalists from another media, but were linked to Charlie Hebdo in the end of a jihadist. We saw a teacher who was attacked, I'll talk about it in a second, and we saw a stabbing in a church in Nice, who killed 3 people before that. We saw also a shift in the profile we saw before. Terrorists were responsible for the attacks in 2015 and 2016 were mostly late 20s, early 30s, people with extensive criminal records and a capacity to use those contacts in the drug trafficking world to find weapons, to organize complex attacks, and to finance them. What we see now is a different profile, either younger, late teens to early 20s, or way older, like late 30s, early 40s. Most of them don't have a criminal record, so don't have the connection necessary, and are reduced to using easier to obtain and easier to use modus operandi, mostly bladed weapons and car ramming attacks. We also saw more targeting of law enforcement during that period. I'll stop shortly on the attack against Samuel Paty in October 16, 2020, was an interesting one, talking about the security on campus and freedom of speech. On October 4th, 2020, we had a history teacher in a middle school in the west of Paris who gave a class on freedom of speech. During that class, he showed a few of the cartoons explaining the idea between offensive speech and freedom of speech to his students who were around 14 and 15. One student who wasn't there during the class because she was missing school lied up to her parents saying she attended the class and she was shocked by what was shown during that class. Her parents, being Islamist extremists, decided to organize a few demonstrations in front of the school, accusing them of Islamophobia, and trying to rally people through a bunch of videos shared on social media. One of the videos was seen by a man called Abdullah Kanzorov, was 18 years old, from Évreux. And 12 days after the class, he showed up in the school and beheaded the teacher in the street in front of the school. It was a big change for the French security status. It was a big concern for us, and it was a big shock for the French nation in general to have a teacher beheaded in the street. Unfortunately, we still had a series of attacks in the following years. I'm going to focus on the last 2 we had in 2023. In October 13, 2023, nearly 3 years after the beheading of Samuel Paty, we had another attack at the teacher. Last October, Dominique Bernard, a 57 teacher from Arras in the north of France, was stabbed to death by a jihadist, Mohamed Mougouchov, who then entered the school and stabbed 3 other people before being arrested by the police. The jihadist was part of an English family who arrived in France as a refugee in 2008. His brother was also convicted of terrorism offenses before that, and he recorded a video of him pleading allegiance to ISIS. The video was recorded but not broadcasted. Then On December 2nd, 23rd, so about 3 months ago, we had an attack on the Birakem Bridge in Paris. 26-year-old jihadist, already convicted for terrorism offenses, but freed early on, stabbed a German tourist to death, stabbed his girlfriend, who survived, and attacked with a hammer a British tourist, was able to escape, killing one and injuring two. So once again, we saw a series of attacks keep on continuing for the last now 13 years. Over the period of 11 years, we saw 54 attacks in France, which is way more than one you could expect. You look at the UK, talking about like probably 20 attacks during that period. US is about the same thing. Germany, Belgium are in a similar manner of around 20. They killed 273 people and injured about 1,000 now. The main target still is the French population at large. You enter any kind of public space and you stab or kill people randomly. But we saw an increasing number of attacks on law enforcement, which is interesting because it seems to be quite of a French thing. I was invited on a Canadian podcast a few months back, and one of the questions was, why so many jihadists attack on law enforcement in France? My answer was, like everywhere else, it's not. If you look at Canada, it never happened. If you look at the UK, it never happened. If you look at Germany, it never happened. The two countries who faced it in some way, France, about 30% of the attacks are targeting a law enforcement officer, and the US, in a slower measure, about 15 to 20% of attacks are targeted at law enforcement, like the New York New Year's Eve attacks last year. Then military targets will make about 50% of the total. What is the future of the threat and what are we afraid of? So as I said, the Olympics are now in 4 months. One of the big concerns we have is the number of jihadists who have been released from prison. Since 2020, we released 486 people convicted of terrorism offenses in France. To that population, you have to add about 900 people who are currently in prison for common law sentences, but considered radicalized by the Bureau of Prison. And it's still 381 terrorists who are still behind bars in France, some of them to be released in the following months. It is a growing concern. As we saw, the current generation of jihadists is mostly young and inexperienced. The ones who are come out of prison are older, more experienced, have the connection they created in prison. Some of them have the connection they created in Iraq and Syria, and have access to significant sum of money and potential weapons that they could use we are in a generation transition in France on the jihadist threat, and we don't know what's going to happen next. But it's an element of concern. To that, we had two other phenomena. The weapon trafficking from Ukraine. I wrote a paper in October 2022, I believe, saying we were going to face some weapon trafficking from Ukraine, and some of it going to reach terrorism end in the west of Europe. We saw that in October 2023 last year, when a jihadist from Tunisia killed 2 Swedish supporters in Brussels using an M4 carbine that was coming from Ukraine. We also saw a rise in 3D printed weapons, mostly in the far right groups in France. I'm happy to talk about far right and far left if you're interested in that too. But still a slower number in jihadist hand. To move it forward, if you're interested in the subject, I'm happy to recommend my book. It's only in French for the moment, so it's going to be limited for you. If anyone knows the publisher, I'm very interested. The book got the Gendarmerie Award last year, so it might be interesting for you. I've published a recent article in English, was published 2 weeks ago now, giving you an overview of the French extremist movement, jihadism, far right, far left. It was published by the Gendarmerie and available in English if you're interested to follow what's happening in France at that moment. And that is for me.
Why don't we? So we have time for questions. Does anybody have any questions in particular for Alexandre? I'm sure the students do. I see someone in the back. Yes.
Hi. Yeah. Hi. Hi. My name is Karen. I just had a quick question to ask you. Maybe it might be or maybe you might have already responded to it. But you did mention towards the end that the French government does release former jihadist citizens who were in prison into the community.
Sure.
So I basically wanted to know, does the government, like the French government, do they have measures implemented to to like follow up on these people who are returned back into the community, despite knowing the fact that they still have access to like weapons, as you had described. But I also did want to ask you, what's your opinion or your thoughts about the fact that with all of this recurring terrorism events that are happening in Paris, one of the very popular destinations for tourists, do you think that the government has some loopholes that they clearly know about, but they still don't want, or they're failing to implement measures to cover up for those loopholes, and what's the way forward?
So I'll answer that in two parts. The first part about like being able to use surveillance against people who come out of prison. We have a few options. Terrorism offenses are interesting for that because they give the government more options, try to look into what the people are doing later on. Some of them are like early released, so they still have to check about the station every day or every week or every month. Some of them are like restricted from going to certain areas, so we're able to keep a tab on them. Is it a 100% sure system? I'd say no. There is some flaws and it's not perfect. It allows to do that. Most of the releases are for people who were convicted quite early on, 2012, 2015, where the sentences were shorter. Now, with the serious attack we faced, sentences are usually longer, and we don't have that many releases. But so we still have kind of the backlog of the release from that early period who's coming out. Then, what could the government do? That's a good question. I agree that Paris and France is the main tourist attraction in the world. We have the Olympics coming on. We have a few things who are big, and between the terrorist attack and the riots, so big thing we have, we saw a drop in tourism in the recent years. What the government could do? Few things are interesting to consider. The first thing is to consider the government's not really in charge of that, but should be clear about that, is having like longer sentences. We had a few cases early 2012, 2014 of people who were convicted really short sentences. I'll give you an example. If you were to leave for Syria to join the Islamic State in 2030, spend a year there fighting, committing war crimes, terrorism attack against the population, and you come back late 2014 in France, before the big attacks, before we realized the importance of the threat, you could be convicted to 6 to 8 years. And with some release program, you'd be out in 4. That was a big concern for us. It was a certain of judicial naivete at that time, with this changing, but maybe not changing as fast. One of the issues I think we face as a democracy in general is the fact that we have a short memory. Paris attack were 9 years ago. For other people, it seemed like it was way more than that, and the threat hasn't changed. When I was writing the book, I had kind of two takes that I was angry at. Some people were not working in the field and saying like, yeah, jihadism is finished in 2015, which was wrong. And some people in the field saying like, it's every day, but we don't tell you. It's not true either. We can put up a list and decide what's happening exactly at the moment. Now I'm now trying to do that every year, to have a number and to be able to be used and more transparent to the general public, do that in French and in English. But it's something we should be better at, remembering the threat is still there. That's the problem for 15 to 20 years, and we have to keep being good on that. I don't know if I answered your question fully, but
When did you go ahead?
First of all, thank you very much for the talk. I had a question regarding the Olympic Games that are coming to France. I assume an event of that magnitude requires certain measures, and we've heard a lot about the country not being fully ready to host this event. Do you feel that this statement is extendable to the security measures that have been implemented or are going to be implemented?
It is a growing concern for us. I mean, gendarmerie, police, firefighter, we're all slightly concerned about that. But it's also part of the job to be concerned, so be careful about that. We had last year was a bad year for terrorism in France, both far right, far left, and jihadism. Jihadism being the main threat by a far margin. So we are concerned about that. It's a huge event. Before the Olympics, you have the flame going through France. It's going to be about 3 weeks of running around in big demonstration in smaller towns, so with smaller resources. So it's a question we have. Any even minor events during the Olympics, from someone like stabbing someone to someone striking someone, would be a big event. So we are really concerned about that. If you look at the history of the Olympic Games, every Olympic Games had some sort of terrorist event during that time. So we are looking at, it's more of a question of when than if. However, the security measures are quite extensive. We are lucky to have a number of crowd control units, big French tradition, all over the country, and able to respond more soulfully than other countries, I guess, would have done. However, it's a growing threat. We have a number of concerns. The Ministry of Interior of France said today, I believe, that out of the 89,000 people who volunteered to be part of the crowd, we find 6 people who were known to be radicalized Islamists. So once again, 6 out of 80,009, and we found them. But there's still the concern that something could happen. To be fully honest, the level of threat we saw is more something. I'm more afraid of something was quite unsophisticated, a knife attack, a carrying attack, than something was on the scale of what happened in 2015. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Dean Solorio.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for being here. We're so proud of you. Congratulations on such thought-provoking work. You know, this is a wonderful contribution to the literature in this area. And I actually have a question for you on the balance between state actions to address terrorism and human rights concerns. As you probably know, most countries that have struggled with terrorism, human rights tends to be a very high concern in the agenda. You know, how do you curb, terrorist attacks or prevent them, but without, hampering all these human rights obligations. And as you know, France is very active, in the human rights world. It has ratified a lot of human rights treaties, so I wonder what your take is on the balance, whether they're accomplishing a good balance, or whether there's a lot of challenges there. And moments like the Summer Olympics, this is at the height of the concern, right?
Absolutely.
So I'm just curious
Oh,
to hear what you think.
I think France has been quite good on the balance. First of all, human rights are always a big concern in France. We have a tradition of looking after that. We saw a number of surveillance measures being put in place in 2015, where mostly like ratifying something that already existed in French law, but wasn't really fully organized. So I think it was mostly going in the right direction of like, we've already been doing that. We now do it under like a stricter law, and we know what's the right limit and the left limit. We saw a number of evolution against that, and we saw also a number of things where maybe hard to understand to a foreign public, but quite in France. I'm thinking about like any law. So we have laws now against terrorism apology. If you were to show up in France and said, "I'm glad the Paris attack happened," you could be charged with terrorism apology, which is surprising in American context when you have the First Amendment and you're able to say that if you wanted to. But it was not an evolution of French law, it was just a ratifying of something we were concerned. The other big concern is always secularism law. France is a pro-secular country. We're very proud of that. It's really important to the French public in general. So we banned a number of religious sites in school, starting in 2004, which was also one of the reasons we got targeted that much in France. There is also a few concerns we are, I think, truly specific to France. Something was always surprising to discuss is the idea of community and the idea of community policing, community organization. We believe in France, and it might be a strange subject for you, that we don't have any communities in France. The first article of the Constitution says we are one people, indivisible. The president has described communitarism as one of the great dangers for the Republic. So no organization can be based on community. We have to treat everyone the same way, and we can't distinguish at any level between citizens. Which is something I'm quite attached to, like most French people, but honestly it's kind of surprising for an Anglo-Saxon crowd in general. So I think we'll be striking kind of a good balance between both of them in the realm of what's available and acceptable to the French public. We had a few like bad faith arguments against us. I'm thinking about the Salah Abdeslam arrest recently. So Salah Abdeslam is the only terrorist to survive the Paris attacks in 2015. His brother killed him in a suicide vest, and he was a big part of organizing it. He just decided at the end to not use his vest, and he fled to Belgium, where he helped organize the Belgium attacks a few months later. He was arrested in Belgium first for shooting at a police officer, was convicted of 20 years, and came back to France for the trial of the Paris attack, which took place in 2022. I was there during the 10 months of trial. It was the biggest trial we ever organized. And he was convicted of life without possibility of parole in France, which is quite a rare event. He was then sent back to Brussels for to be tried on his participation of the Brussels attacks in March 2016. And then we had a Brussels judicial system saying, yeah, it's cruel and unusual punishment to be convicted of life without parole, so he shouldn't be sent back to France. Like, I don't think it is. He was sent back to France after a few months of diplomatic negotiations, and his lawyer just published recently an editorial saying life without parole is a disguised way to give him the death penalty, which is not. So we had a few arguments like that, which I think were quite unfair against what we tried to do. He was convicted of an attack who killed 130 people in France, maybe 1,000. After a fair trial of 10 months, he was able to talk, and he had counsel. He should do his sentence in France, and he should do the full sentence. It was kind of a, yeah, I don't know if the answer was acceptable, because I went everywhere. But yeah, that's my take on it.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Sure.
I was hoping, if it's not too much of an ask, if you could compare the systems of France and the U.S. for like weapons control, because we have this big Second Amendment in the U.S. And I was wondering if we should have more strict, if you think stricter weapons control in France is a viable option as a solution for some of the terrorist attacks. And I was wondering if you could kind of make any analogies to the U.S. Or you think that avenue is easier in France because of the lack of the Second Amendment?
So I think the book of the Daniel Baldwin book is called Road Warriors, about jihadism fighting abroad and coming back to their country. And he said something that was quite true. He was interviewing a French official from the Ministry of Interior. He didn't name him, and said, if we had your problem with guns and no problem with terrorism, you're bloodbaths every day. We are lucky enough that they have trouble finding weapons. Still, they were able to find some and commit a number of attacks. So I go through two angles to that question. Starting 2015, we had few things we were able to work in our favors to limit terrorist abilities to get. First thing was what we call the Molins Protocol. François Molins was the main DA for France for terrorism offenses, and he said, I'm going after any kind of drug trafficker who provided weapon to terrorists, other terrorists. So they were not looking at 6 to 7 years, but now we get 20 to 30. So we had a number of drug traffickers who just called us and said, I've sold weapon to those people. I rather you know that. I won't get in charge of it. Then COVID happened. Most of the flow of weapons in Western Europe come from Eastern Europe. The Balkan flow is drying out, so it's mostly Moldova now, been a bit from Turkey. So with COVID and every flow being blocked, they couldn't get weapons in. So we saw a rise in the price of a black market Kalashnikov was something like 1,500 euros in early 2010. It's now more like 4,000 or 5,000. It's not much for a drug trafficker. It's a bit of money for a terrorist. So that plays in part. We haven't seen any attacks in France committed with a legally owned firearms. We have few assailants who were legal owners. You can be legal owner of a bunch of things in France, but none of them use them to commit an attack. So most of the weapons used were illegal in nature. Obviously, if we're able to open more, we'll have more people who will be able to use them, and a few of them will be poorly intentioned. We also saw a need to rearm more law enforcement. Most law enforcement personnel in France, or every police officer in France is armed. It's not the UK or Ireland. But most of them were only carrying pistols in 2015. We now augmented the number of SMGs they're able to carry, some machine guns, and assault rifle now carrying HK G36 in most police cars. Which is a big change in training, in the tactical reform of France, but made a big difference in the following years. Once again, the question in the US, I'm not an expert on gun control in the US, the question is like, there's such a big number of weapons in civilian arms that it makes a huge difference. You can't really get them back. The Australian argument is often put together, but Australia picked up like 230,000, took about 400 million in the US. That's a different scale, that's a different situation. But yeah, the fact that gun control was more restrictive in France helped us. We still see, because of I think the last few years of either crisis or terrorist attack, a huge rise, but in most of Western Europe, of people legally arming themselves. Some of them might turn into an attack. We haven't seen any in the recent years. And even if, at least for France, I'm confident that no attacks was committed with illegal firearms. It might be different for Germany or the UK. Sorry, it's kind of a vast answer too, because it's a vast question.
Other questions? Yes, I'm sorry. Why don't we go?
Okay.
Sorry.
So earlier on, on, you just touched briefly on the uniqueness of the strength of the separation between church and state in France.
Yeah.
I was curious to know if you think that a potential softening of laïcité could help to ameliorate the tensions between religious extremists and the state, or if you think that at this point softening those laws could increase tensions.
So, a few things I think have to be considered. First one is whatever the on jihadism, because we didn't have a lot of like the most religion we have been most against what we faced. It's not like if even like outside of the jihadist world, just on the people who are like conservative, we haven't seen I think we haven't seen a good faith argument against secularism in France. Following the Charlie Hebdo case is interesting for that. So 2005, we got a Danish journal publishing a few cartoons of the Prophet, and then we saw a number of threats against them. A few journals in Europe decided to republish them as a way of supporting them, Charlie Hebdo being one of them. What happened, and most of the threats coming out of that situation were the fact of people in anyone in France seeing something that's offensive. It's a number of preachers in Egypt who picked up those cartoons, mixed them with a few other images, including pornographic images, and a few images from a pig contest in France, and said that here's what we say of the Prophet in France, and started that worldwide threat against Charlie Hebdo. It started in 2005, and we could have believed that 10 years later it wasn't much of a concern. The only one who forgot about it was us. They kept on the thing and they went at it harder. So I don't think softening the situation would make it easier. I also think it would be quite unacceptable to the French public, who have been quite proudly secular. It's a big part of the French nation and would be really poorly perceived. But I don't think you will get people who say, oh yeah, if they're making one step in your direction, we'll make one step toward less violence. Because once again, most of the things they still complain about, I think happened 20 years ago. The law against what you call obvious sign of religiousness in school. In French, you can't go to school with a big cross. You can go to school wearing a veil. You can't go to school wearing a kippah. That's thing considered private and should be part of the public discourse. It's not a new phenomenon. It's been 20 years, and before that, it was always kind of the situation in school, but it wasn't low. All adversaries didn't really see the difference and have been on the same path since then, whatever the situation has been. Once again, my take, I'm not a religious expert, so I might be wrong.
And yeah.
Thank you. I'm currently taking a class on international money laundering, terrorism and corruption, which is of course focused more on the side of countering the financing of terrorism.
Yes.
And we're also seeing a lot of developments in this area currently in the EU, with like agreeing on a new directive and maybe a centralized authority.
Yeah.
How do you evaluate these steps and maybe the role of the EU in general in this grand scheme, not only the financing side of terrorism, but also like just countering terrorism?
So, not an EU expert, here's what I would say. First thing, I think those steps are important if you talk about like international terrorism, which is still a concern. We still have a pretty big franchise of Al-Qaeda in Yemen, who's able to organize attacks in the Western world, so we should be looking at that with careful eyes. If you look at France, at least, and I think it's quite similar in Germany, in the UK, and most of the Western Europe, we mostly find people who are financing themselves. And we saw that kind of like low-cost trend kind of going through the years. 9/11 was about $400,000 to organize, financed by Osama bin Laden. If you look at the Toulouse attack in 2012 in France, 7 people killed over 3 attacks. It's about 25,000 to buy weapons, to travel, to organize, paid for by drug trafficking and burglaries. If you look at the Charlie Hebdo attacks, about 10K, organized through low-level loan. If you look at the beheading of Samuel Paty, it's the price of a butcher knife and a fake pistol. That's 25 euros. It's less likely to have major effect, but it's available to most people. So I think what we face at the moment, at least on the local jihad situation in every country in Europe, is more of that sort. And still have to look at what could happen from Afghanistan, who might be the biggest incubator at the time. maybe from the Sahel region, still considering that, from Yemen for sure, and be able to stop that, but I don't think it will impact the vast majority of attacks now who are like organized from inside the country and financed from inside the country.
Any other questions? I just had one.
Sure.
Actually, I was thinking about, I was actually in Paris after the Charlie Hebdo attacks. And so unlike here, in the streets there were officers with big rifles, as you say, and patrolling like the Eiffel Tower and different places like that. And so I thought there was a real show of security. Like I felt comfortable as a tourist there that, you know, and I was in the Marais, I was near synagogues, et cetera. And so it was a very tough time. And then they were in the subways as well. And so it seemed like there was an enhancement of just police presence, which seemed pretty comfortable. And so I'm not sure exactly, so I was there like maybe 2 weeks and then I left. And I know you said there was a period of time where there wasn't anything happening. So I was just wondering if what the gendarmerie or, you know, the other security forces in France are doing is that part of it, like sort of a show of everyday force? Also, are they infiltrating these cells? And then other, following up with that question about financing, I know in the US, one of the things we do is track bank records and, you know, transfers of large amounts of money. I'm sure they're transferred illegally, but to the extent that you can track it. So is there some, have all three been like sort of a show of force, but also infiltrating the cells and then using, trying to, as you said, money is not a big deal apparently in the terrorism.
Not
that
the
you're
last few,
talking
at
about.
least not on the last few attacks,
Yeah.
who are quite cheap to organize. So three things. The question of show of force. I think you have to consider two things. So there is the classic police and gendarmerie presence. France has two main law enforcement agencies, National Police and National Gendarmerie, which are patrolling on regular, and we have a special event, we have a bit more of them. What you might make reference into is also the presence of military officers, and NCOs and enlisted men
Yes.
in the street of Paris wearing camouflage uniform, which was part of what we call Operation Sentinel. So Operation Sentinel was been starting in 2015 to protect first special places where afraid could be attacked, and then areas in different big cities. That situation evolved from years to years. When the threat was at its peak, it was about 10,000 soldiers in on French street trying to protect people. It went down to up to less than 3,000 and kind of moves according to the threat. Is it a useful solution? Question remains. The main thing that Sentinel did, we had a few cases where they were able to respond to terrorist attacks. I'm thinking about Marseille 2017, Strasbourg 2018, and they were able to either injure or kill the terrorist. But what happened most of the time, they become the target of attacks. Mm-hmm. So there is some kind of a cynical point of view, but they are quite a hard target. Most of them are able to neutralize the terrorist and lead to his arrest. So it wasn't a bad solution. But it's mostly security theater than it is a real solution to that. Mm-hmm. Infiltrations in France are quite a discrete subject. We don't have that much data available, so it's really hard to talk about it in detail.
Makes sense.
Some of it exists, but the scale of it, the organization is quite confidential. The last question was the question about financing.
Yeah, and I guess you're.
I
think you're
and
not using it
we
that much, right?
We have a special institution called TRACFIN, who's in charge of any kind of financial crime, and terrorism is a big part of them, and try to look at money being sent by or to the terrorist cell. They were responsible by a number of arrests by people who were still in France selling their social aid to Syria and Iraq to pay for their son or daughters who were part of the Islamic State, and it led to a number of arrests that way.
Okay. Any other questions? The one other thing, just as the last thought was, it's sort of relating to human rights or other mechanisms of trying to address this. And is there any, I don't know if it's re-education or like, you're French, you know, we're all, you know, one community. Why, you know, is there any attempt at that, like talking to people and trying to change their minds?
So there were some. To be fully honest, some of them were. We had a de-radicalization program started in 2016. We're like desperately looking for a solution to do that. to be fully honest, it was a complete failure, and it was sometimes really naive in the way it was organized. I'll give you a few examples because I think they're funny in some way, but like we had a few embassy class in prisons. We were asking jets who just came back from Syria, some of them fighting the Battle of Aleppo, for like 6 months to caress ferrets to try to create empathy with an animal. I don't think that it was really working. Then we started a de-radicalization program when we sent people who haven't been convicted but sent by their family because they had radical view, which is not a crime in France, so it's hard to send someone, so it's never really mandatory, to places where people to learn about French culture, learn about French history, French literature, sing the Marseillaise, and it wasn't a success either. We had a few people who were supposed to be in those classes. It was a 6-week program, and then we were arrested in an apartment full of Kalashnikov because they used that as a way to kind of disguise what they wanted to do. To be fully honest, the de-radicalization program we started in France in 2016 has been abandoned since. Was started by 3 academics, which I won't name today. 3 of them are currently charged with embezzlement, and one of them with sexual assault on a woman he was supposed to de-radicalize. So not the most reliable people we put in charge during those programs. But I think it says a lot about de-radicalization in general. It's not, in my opinion at least, it's not a viable solution. It doesn't work in the UK, doesn't work for us, doesn't work for the Saudis, doesn't work for Sri Lanka, doesn't work for. It was a noble attempt of trying to do something. It wasn't something we would work out. We can't change the way people think about a subject,
Gotcha.
especially something we are so passionate about.
Right, right. Any other thoughts or questions on this? Well, Alexandre, thank you so much for coming and sharing your